Welcome back. Today we are covering Chapter 4 of Merkle and Plummer's, beginning with New Testament Greek, and doing an overview of the verbal system. Here are the topics that we'll cover in this video, starting with an overview of the entire system. Verbs in English are somewhat limited in the amount of information they contain in the word. This sentence, I am singing, includes the verb singing, but singing only is communicating the action that is being performed. You also need a pronoun and a helping verb to make the sentence and communicate something more precise. However, verbs in Greek are very compact and contain a lot of information comparatively. They communicate a whole sentence in just one word. They express both person and number through different endings. So let's talk about person and number. Person refers to the subject of a verbal idea. So the first person would be I or we in English. Second person would be the word you, and that would be for singular or plural. Third person would be he, she, it, or they for plural. So in first person, the subject is speaking. In second person, the subject is being spoken to. And in the third person, the subject is being spoken about. Number refers to how many things are related to the action of the verb. So in English, for a singular person, we would say I, you, he, she, it. For plural, we would say we, you, or they. Now let's talk about voice. The concept of voice helps us understand who is doing the action, or is the action being performed on someone else. The voice indicates the way that the subject relates to the action or the state expressed by the verb. So we have three different voices in Greek: active, middle, and passive. In the active voice, the subject is performing the action. In the middle voice, the subject is both performing the action and is impacted by the action, while in the passive voice, the subject is receiving the action. In the active voice, you can have transitive and intransitive action. Transitive action can take a direct object. So in this example, I see a tree. Intransitive action cannot take a direct object. So I am walking would be an example. From the Greek, it says God loved the world. This is transitive and it's taking an object. In the middle voice, the subject is performing the action, but also is somehow affected by the action. One way this happens is through a reflexive means. So the subject is performing the action upon themselves. So this word says he will dress himself. The middle voice also may indicate a special interest. The subject may have some sort of special interest in the action, or they may be benefiting from the action. I see for myself. So in this example, all things you pray and ask for. There are different categories of middle voice verbs: reciprocity, verbs of movement, verbs of self-involvement, and verbs of passivity. Reciprocity involves two parties, dehomai and apokrinomai. Apokrinomai means to answer, so you need a reply to someone. Movement, erhomai, to go, to come. Self-involvement, thinking, feeling, deciding. And passivity, the subject doesn't choose or cannot refuse to be a subject of the action. In the passive voice, the subject of the verb receives the action. So an example in English would be, in active voice, Paul writes a letter, whereas the passive voice, we are written on his heart. We are still the subject, but in the passive voice, we are being written on his heart. Some examples in Greek would be, he is healing the woman versus the woman is being healed. In the first example, he is the subject and healing is the action, whereas in the passive voice, she is the subject and being healed is still the action. We don't know who the agent of the action is in the passive voice. The agent of the passive voice can be added by using upo, plus the genitive. So in this case, upo tu curio, by the Lord. Now let's talk about mood. When we talk about mood, this is not how you feel about the verb, but this indicates how the author is understanding the verbal action's relation to reality. So is this factual? Is this something that's possible action? Is it something that's desired action? Is this something that's being commanded or contingent? So we have 4 different moods in the Greek: indicative, subjunctive, optative, and imperative. So indicative is the mood that represents something is certain or will be certain. He went fishing, or will he go fishing? This is something that is factual. The subjunctive mood represents something that's probable, contingent, or indefinite. He might go fishing, or whenever he goes fishing. The optative mood represents something that's possible or hoped for. I wish he would go fishing. The imperative mood represents something as requested or commanded. Go fishing, or please go fishing. So in English, when we have mood, we have to use those helping words to understand the context. In Greek, we can understand the context of the tense and the aspect, and this is a little bit different from English. Greek has 6 tense forms: the present, I am loosing, or I loose; the imperfect, I was loosing; the future, I will loose; the aorist, which is similar to our past, I loosed; the perfect, I have loosed; and the pluperfect, I had loosed. So we also have aspect in Greek. The aspect is the subjective perspective or viewpoint from which an author is communicating the action of the verb. In the imperfect and present tense, this is called imperfective aspect. This is where the author is depicting an action as ongoing or in process, and it doesn't pay attention to when the action began or when it's going to end. There's also perfective aspect. This is in the aorist tense. This is an action that is complete or whole. It had a beginning, it had an ending, and now it's done. Then there's the stative aspect, and this is found in the perfect and pluperfect tenses. This is where the author is depicting a state of affairs or an ongoing relevance resulting from a previous action or state. Now let's take a look at your first verb. The verb to be in English is very irregular. We have I am, you are, he is, I will be, I was, we were. These are 6 different forms of the same word, depending on whether the action is talking about a singular or plural subject. The verb to be is a copulative verb because it's joining things together. And it doesn't take a direct object, but it takes a predicate nominative. So I am he. If you answer the phone, this is him, that's actually incorrect in the English grammar. So you would take a word that normally would be the subject of a sentence. And then there is they are good. So you are taking a word in the nominative form, basically. So here are your Greek ame forms. You have ame, a, estin, esmen, este, and asin. Now let's take a look at the vocabulary for this chapter. So your vocabulary this week is predominantly verbs. Last week you had verbs that ended in omega and omai, and this week all of your verbs are ending in omega. So as you look at these verbs, you can notice all of these end in omega, and that will be a helpful way to know when you're looking at a verb. So you have ago, I lead, I bring, and again, when you get a verb in the lexical form, it is giving you that first person present active indicative, and we'll talk more about that for the next video, but just remember they are giving you the first person translation for that as well. So in red, you'll see the suggested hints: pedagogical, I lead, I bring; blepo, I see, look at; didasko, I teach; egero, I raise up; krino, I judge, condemn. And we have meno, I remain, abide, dwell. I think of I remaino. Upago, this is actually a compound word. So you see that ago from your vocab earlier, but this is upago. So I think of upago away, I go away, depart. Doulos, back to nouns. So you see that article back in your lexical information. This is the masculine word, and it means slave. Thanatos, Marvel movie buffs may remember this from Thanos. So Thanatos means death. And Suke, this is a feminine word. So this means soul, life, living being. And also hora, hour. Pay attention to that rough breathing mark, hora. And then if, weather, and the same ete, if, weather. Kathos, as, just as, even as. And then hosts, as or like. Remember those rough breathing marks there. And that's your vocab and lesson 4.